Since the start of last year, I've been going down a rabbit hole listening to drum and bass, house, breakcore, and basically a lot of EDM or other extreme genres of music. Well, at least the new wave of atmospheric drum and bass activates the neurons in my brain. I have this video right here to thank for my newly found interest in drum and bass and EDM as a whole. But past the hordes of subpar drum and bass producers that sprang up within the past few years, and much so after the I want to talk about one of the artists that brought me into this world of music. Remember that video I mentioned earlier? Yeah, the first artist featured on that playlist we're talking about today. Yeah, we're talking about Starlit. Besides a few tidbits of information, a Twitter page, and an official Discord server, yes, I did pay $3 to get in, there isn't really much to go off of when talking about Starlit. I guess I have a habit of covering mysterious artists. From what I've been able to gather, she is based out of Oregon and has been making music since 2018. She is also possibly a pagan, Satanist, occultist, whatever the fuck this is, and also does a fuck ton of drugs. I mean, that would explain all the rambling she does on her Twitter and Patreon, but whatever. I'll admit, the art posts on her Twitter are pretty cool in a weird kind of way. Okay, so are there any good songs she made beyond Frozen Fleeting Heart? I'm glad you asked. So, Starlit, or Nia as she goes by, has a lot of music not just on Bandcamp, but also a lot of loosies on YouTube and SoundCloud. For the most part, I'll just focus on the full-length releases and EPs. Speaking of which, it would be more accurate to call a lot of her projects compilations more than full, comprehensive albums, or maybe beat tapes is a good name for it. The tracks on these projects are generally a mix of house, trance, hip-hop, surprisingly ambient, drum and bass, and actual breakcore. For the uninitiated, this is drum and bass, and this is breakcore. I have a somewhat decent idea of what I'm talking about. Anyway, the only thing really connecting these songs together is the fact that they're on the same project. As a result, the songs on each project vary wildly in quality, ranging from really boring to really good. If I were to view each album as one singular experience, they probably wouldn't be really rated highly. In fact, they kind of suck as singular experiences. A lot of the time, she has a lot of good musical ideas that don't really go anywhere, and rarely do I feel her songs convey a complete musical thought, so to say. The issue is compounded when the tracks are 4+ minutes long, sometimes breaking 10 minutes. I get it, it's EDM, it's supposed to be repetitive, and in this specific subgenre it takes a lot from ambient, which by nature doesn't have a lot going musically. Even with that understanding, the songs just kind of feel unfinished sometimes. Either the mixing just falls flat, or the track just sounds like a rough draft, or it's missing one element that would make it really good, or at least worth a 3-minute listen. As a result, a lot of her shorter tracks actually sound a lot better. Over there, those tracks don't really overstay their welcome, and due to the shorter length, the songs sound a bit more concise. Either that, or she makes a track that actually does feel well thought out, and one musical idea is interesting enough to listen to for 5+ minutes. With the latter, the track's repetition is more hypnotic than annoying. It's pretty likely that her music is just meant as background noise or something to zone out to, which I can totally see. I personally like it when an artist can make something that can retain my interest throughout the length of a song, but hey, whatever. We all got awful attention spans, right? This is a little bit easier when there are vocals present, but it's way harder when the music is just primarily instrumentals. Even still, I'd say for the majority of her albums in the discography, there are like 3 to 5 tracks worth putting on a playlist, while the rest aren't really worth a full listen. Hell, that's what I do. Maybe all this music wasn't meant to be picked apart and analyzed, but fuck it, I'm doing it anyway. If we're being real, everything past this point is actually worth listening to. Don't worry, we'll talk about the early stuff, but for a solid chunk of it, the music is pretty mediocre besides a few hidden gems. So for the sake of time, I'll be covering the albums from this point on with more detail. Also, I'll note that I'm just covering her albums that are on Bandcamp and Apple Music since I don't use Spotify. And yes, this means all actual 28 albums. I don't really remember how many albums I reviewed for the Viper video, but 28 shouldn't be that bad, right? Alright, so are you guys ready for the lightning round of the early Starlit discography? No? Whatever, we're doing it anyway. Underwhelming first effort, but that's to be expected. This album starts to add more D&B into the mix, but still has some really baffling production choices, such as the bad mini brass on Onslaught Rain, and the bass on Never Gonna Be is out of tune. There's only a handful of good tracks here, with Aquarius 2 and Pisces 4 sounding like bootleg Hotline Miami tracks. The tracks are too long here and doesn't really do anything new.
I forgot to record my thoughts on this, but there's only 2 good tracks.
Right here is a lot of rough demos and the questionable Pissy Pamper remix. This tape has 1 good track. Over here, the songs sound at least finished, but it's still more of the same. The Moment sounds like a pretty enjoyable Daft Punk sounding song, but for the most part, the songs just drag on for too long and are boring to listen to. So transitioning from the early discography into the middle era, we leap from mashing random notes on a keyboard to actually sounding like a competent, at most D&B producer. Speaking of which, we start things off with Fatalist. While a solid amount of the tracks sound pretty minimal, it doesn't mean that it sounds unfinished, or at least not completely. The best tracks here are definitely the house cuts on the album, such as Fade, Catharsis, and Twilight. Starlit also starts to incorporate a trap sound into her music, like on the tracks Perish and Neoscape Groove. Apotheosis sounds like some leftovers from her earlier projects, nothing too special here. Now, Fantasia has a few interesting tracks, such as Mr. Love Myself, which is probably a jab at the sewer person, but whatever. The track has a lot of interesting, noisy, and ambient layering in both the synths and drums that I like, and it managed to keep my attention for the entire runtime. The track Wave also has a similar noisiness to it that I like as well. The rest of the tracks drop this harsh mixing for more chaotic melodies, except for the track Shine, which is built around this one vocal sample that at least sounds somewhat interesting. Now for 1,000 Things I Could Tell You. The album, I mean. The album with the track Frozen Fleeting Heart. Well, before we get to that, let's actually go over the other tracks. The opening track, Fragile, sounds like a trap version of the file selection screen from a video game. Definitely the Super Mario 64 one. I know somebody sampled that, but this is Neo we're talking about. The tracks Soul Resting and In Orbit kind of drag out longer than they reasonably should have, but they at least sound pretty cool. The track I Felt You has a pretty good loop behind it and has some interesting drum break layering as well. The track becomes a lot better when the vocal chops come in. Armored Core starts off really promising with the synth melody, but kind of drops off after realizing the melody is going through the whole track with no interesting variation. The tracks Flow, My Love is a Synthesis, or Fatigue or Falsetto are also tracks that fall into that entertainment department. Now for Frozen Fleeting Heart. It's an okay track. I mean, in the context of the discography, it doesn't sound too different from what she normally does. It's a loop of Crystallized by Camellia with a unchopped Amen and 808, some chopped anime samples, and some extra percussion layered onto it. Nowadays, I listen to it for nostalgia's sake since it's the song that got me into EDM and drum and bass, but the song itself isn't super intriguing besides the anime samples that bring some extra sauce to the track. She has way better tracks than this in my opinion, and beyond this, hopefully the casual fans watching can look past this and look at the rest of the discography. The next album, Valentine Reel, is another nothing burger in the discography. We basically heard this in previous albums, a lot of cool ideas, which for the most part don't go anywhere beyond the initial loop. There are a handful of gems in this track list though. The track Chord and Coordinates have this really interesting tempo shift that goes throughout it. Each little section has its own distinct vibe, going from a mid-tempo track slowing down and then speeding up into an actual breakcore track. Tech U, while not much variance goes on through the entire track, has a really nice bounce to it. It's kind of funny how we have an album called Unfinished Tracks and Melodies since, in my opinion, a good amount of her tracks sound like rough drafts. But at least here the tracks live up to the album's name. The track 50 and 78 sound the most finished here. The former is a spacey trap beat, which is mostly driven by a nice sounding vocal sample. Despite looping for most of the track with little variation, it manages to be engaging through the whole runtime. 78 is a lot more repetitive, but the vocal chops here sound interesting enough and keep me listening. Now onto the album Civigy. This is one of the projects I feel aren't mostly skips. Brother Chun is a pretty competent drungle track with some interesting and coherent break work, and a vocal sample to break up the monotony. Echolocation, while super minimal, actually works here and feels like a complete idea. Veni Vidi Vici is a alright track that sounds like the THX intro sound. The track after that one, Twilight Dance, is probably one of my favorite songs in the Starlit discography. It's a mid-tempo track with this looping vocal sample that starts off normal, but throughout the rest of the track it just constantly reverberates and sounds like it's on a constant feedback loop. Overall, the track has that hypnotic kind of vibe that I like. Even though not much is going on in the track, it keeps me engaged. IWBWU is also a pretty good closer for the album. The only tracks I would consider skips are Wings to Fly, Time and Love All at Once, and Heart Thermitage. I feel the first two have a little too much going around and feels really cluttered. The third track has the opposite problem where it's so minimal that it's really boring. I mean, that's a third of the album, but at least I could say 2/3 are pretty good. The album still here is a overall solid project. We have more good ambient D&B tracks like Storm Logic, Deep, Forbidden Gene, and Patrol. The Fly Me to the Moon remix is short and sweet and actually sounds pretty okay. I'd probably blow my brains out if it were 2+ minutes long. Most of what she has here is usual form for Starlit. However, there are two exceptions to this where she decides to become a full-on boom bap producer with tracks like Cartographer and Cold Street. As a guy who mainly makes boom bap, this immediately caught my attention. This former track has one ambient note with some gross beat on it, which, while being pretty simple, sounds really good. Cold Street is also pretty similar, but here it's piano driven, They even got like scratching on it, which is really cool. I feel like she has this boom bap thing down, but unfortunately this is the only time she does it in the discography. I kinda wanna hear more of this from her just to see what she can do with it. I'm kinda optimistic thinking it's a boom bap influence, since this definitely could be a homage to, say, some down-tempo tracks on the Silent Hill 3 soundtrack. Starlight Moon is more of the same, and unlike the previous album, not much is too interesting. These tracks right here, they are good. The 30-minute song at the end, not really. I'm not listening to all that, but congratulations or sorry for your loss. I did stop and think about this project, and I noticed this isn't on streaming services. Either way, nothing's really too interesting here. Good tracks are right here. 8 tracks for Hormones has 5 good tracks for my ears. The intro track, Shoddy, with 5 emojis in front, is a cool sounding ambient D&B track. You'd think the constant melodic riff that's repeated throughout the song would make me dislike it, but at the very least there's enough going around that keeps it interesting. I mainly like how the drums change sometimes and the occasional horn sample that comes in. The tracks Violet and Nani Yo are particularly, I don't know how else to say it, violent sounding D&B tracks that have this cool, oppressive atmosphere to them. But there are 2 versions of the track Girls Love that, despite being the same song, have completely different vibes due to mixing. The dirty mono mix sounds like I'm playing some kind of shovelware Barbie game on a DS with blown out speakers. The clean mix sounds like a remastered version for mobile where I'd get ads every 10 seconds. I personally like the dirty mix more for the atmosphere. The last 2 untitled tracks are skips, nothing really interesting there. Now, Millennium is the first album I consider to be good front to back. In my opinion, no skips here. Sure, there are songs that are better than others, but nothing that really bores me or is super obnoxious. Dataline is a track that keeps its own uneasy tension throughout its runtime and is able to be engaging even if nothing really much changes throughout the track. Frost Penumbra's Edge has this vocal sample that plays throughout it that initially gives you the feeling that it's going to be a chill track, but once the synths kick in, the mood just completely changes. The track indeed does sound frosty. The tracks Wax Dark and If I are good atmospheric tracks, while the track following it, Tenshi, sounds hyperactive, but not in a hyperpop kind of way. It's one of those few tracks in the Starlit discography I would consider fun to listen to, while the rest of it is disassociation music. The album rounds off with what I assume to be remakes of older tracks, which include Dream, Ninebreaker, and this song I can't pronounce. While the latter 2 are pretty solid, it's Dream that's definitely in the list of my favorite Starlit tracks. The whole melody is just a small piano lick, but the one thing that keeps me engaged the whole time is that vocal sample. I don't know whether it's from an anime or it's a Vocaloid or whatever it is, that vocal sample is just mesmerizing. I think you can see a pattern here. I really like the vocal melodies. Anyway, in terms of this sound, this is peak Starlit. But from that personal high note comes Rave Intentions. I'll be honest, coming right off of Millennium, this felt like a bit of a step back. And why is that? Well, the tracks just kind of sound like leftovers from earlier work. So yeah, there's just a lot of tracks that go nowhere. I don't think really anything from here catches my interest besides, say, the cover art and the 522 BPM song. The last album in this middle era is Dysphorics, and thankfully it's actually interesting. The opening track Phantasmu has some good break work and actually earns its length. The tracks Rude Boy, Pedal, and Foundations have a more traditional jungle sound. Specifically, I like how Foundations opens with a off-tempo-ish synth arp and how the drums just play around it. It doesn't last throughout the whole track, but it definitely is very ear-catching. These tracks here sound like leftovers from Rave Intentions, which already sounds like a Leftovers project. As for the last 2 tracks, Don't Wanna Miss You and Untitled, they have this weirdly soulful sound to them. The former has a piano loop that sounds like this sample right here, which has been used in a whole bunch of old Memphis rap songs, and Untitled, which obviously has a soul sample running throughout. So at this point in the discography, we go through a big change in sound from the normal atmospheric D&B she's been doing up until this point into the hex/surge genre. I'm not super well versed in this genre, but from how I describe it, it's like a combination of hyperpop, trap, and nightcore, but turned up to the point of being very abrasive. For the weirdos in the audience, think Cemetery but on helium, or maybe Witch Trap would be another way to describe it. Starlit's take on the genre fuses drum and bass with these elements alongside trap beats that littered her other albums. As a Bit Crush enthusiast myself, I really like the sound, even if it makes my ears bleed. For a genre that's currently imitating Sewer Sled, Gore Shit, G&B Chili, and early Starlit, her Hex take on drum and bass is very unique. But before we get into the Hexed albums proper, there are 2, I'd say, transistory albums that kinda lead into that. Intra Extra Ravenous Drip is one of these first albums, and despite the album cover being the way it is, the music isn't really different from something you'd hear on Dysphorics. Although here, there's a little bit more emphasis on ambient soundscapes. You can hear this on tracks like Red Light, Red Life, Signal, and Soulsucker, and its 10-minute extension. Basically most of the album. The title track in No Good has more of that traditional sound we're used to, and Breakbeat Cute kinda sounds like a gore shit throwaway, take that as you will. If you like ambient drum and bass, then this project is for you, but for me I don't really find myself coming back here. It's not really heavy enough to drop into my Breakcore playlist, but it's too ominous to really put in my chill playlist. The next album, Estradiol Valeriat, is definitely more interesting in terms of experimentation. I don't know if this feature has cropped up before, but here is when she starts including vocals into her tracks. I don't mean like vocal samples, but her actual voice. Does it sound good? Well, if you ever wanted someone to be moaning in your ear for the duration of the track, then this album is for you. As for me, it sometimes works with the track such as Ice in My Drink, where she actually says the name of the song. I think in some parts as well, she chops up her voice and uses it in a similar manner to Frozen Fleeting Heart, which is pretty interesting to listen to. But most of the time, I think the atonal moaning is pretty annoying. Vocals will appear on her albums from this point forward, so it's interesting to see where that experimentation starts. So what about the other tracks, or even the album as a whole? Honestly, I'm kinda underwhelmed. If I'm being real, this sounds mostly like a shitpost. The album has a similar ambient sound to the previous one, but here they feel just kinda incomplete and half-assed. There's some okay tracks, but I won't listen to this again. Even though the next album technically is, well, all that, I'm kinda stuck on how to review this album and similar albums to it here. You see, this album, and the ones on screen, are just albums uploaded as one long track. Since I can't really keep track of what track is playing, I feel I can't really talk about them properly. From listening to them, it seems like they have demo tracks of songs that would appear on future albums, and some tracks that only appear on this specific mix. And since I can't really rate them, I'll say I like this one the most. Okay, so now we're in the actual Hexed material with the album Arcana Infernum. This album was actually my first introduction to Hexed, and this album from front to back is just chaotic. The atmosphere of this album is both ethereal and crushing at the same time, and I don't even know how that's possible. The use of recorded vocals here actually fits the album perfectly. Instead of just annoying moaning, it's replaced with these whispers that give the tracks that appear on them a sinister kind of vibe. Since I know Nia uses FL Studio, there's no doubt in my mind that growth speed is just plastered throughout this whole album, which kinda explains the sudden tempo fluctuations and rapid stuttering that appear on some of the tracks. I kinda struggle talking about this album in depth because I feel this is one of those that has to be listened to really understand what's going on. The one downside to the album that really isn't a downside at all is that the tracks kinda sound the same and all blend together, which I see as a negative most of the time, but here they just flow into each other really well. But as a result, there's not really a track I'd consider my favorite or one I'd recommend over the other. Also, one last thing to note, some of the tracks here seem to be Hex remixes of older tracks, and of the ones I cared to find, I feel that the remixes are way better than the originals. It's definitely not an album that I'd recommend to people coming off of Frozen Fleeting Heart, but this is a top tier Starlit album. The second Hexed album, Frenzy, is definitely an album. It takes everything that made Arcana Infernum good, and on paper made it better. If the last album was essentially making my brain melt, this album makes me feel like watching someone's brain melt. It sounds similar, but it's a bit different in the finer details. The mixing on this album, for the most part, is a lot cleaner, and only a handful of tracks have that super distorted sound. Although cleaner might not be the right word, more so some tracks just sound flat in terms of mixing. As a result, it doesn't sound as punchy like the last album. However, that's not to say that some of the songs are less experimental or chaotic. In fact, some of the tracks are so crazy that some of the elements don't even feel fully implemented yet, and are just kind of there for the sake of being there. There's this gunshot and bullet dropping sound effect that appears throughout the whole album, and I don't know about anyone else, but I kind of grew to despise this sound effect. Like, it was cool the first time, but after like the 50th time, just no. But enough about sound effects. What tracks are actually interesting? These tracks right here gave me the same feel as Arcana Infernum with its distortion, so that's a plus. I like this track here mainly for its vocals and not exactly for its lyrical content, which for the most part is, yeah, you can't even discern what she's saying. These tracks here, despite their flat mixing, are pretty interesting to listen to just because it's a constant assault on the senses. These tracks right here are also just pretty cool, nothing super crazy. Overall, this was a logical escalation of what was brought in the first album, but I feel it didn't manage to fully capture what made the first one great. So the last album, released as of writing this, is Sabbath of Silence. This comes after a nearly 2-year gap from the last proper release. It's still very much a Hex project, but this time around it feels a lot more subdued. Sure, the tempo changes, vocals, and the bullet dropping sound effect is there for good measure, but this album isn't trying to break your speakers. This feels more like occult lo-fi trap beats to worship Lucifer to. In terms of my own enjoyment of the album, I'm kinda neutral on it. On one hand, I do appreciate that the whole project is one coherent experience. Here I describe the album as cloud hexed. It has elements of Hex, but has a heavy cloud rap influence, with it being down-tempo and ethereal. There's no drum and bass on this album whatsoever. With the exception of one track where it feels like a traditional Hex track, the down-tempo tracks throughout the album just kinda meander from start to finish. The album clocks in at 11.5 minutes, and from my experience, it went in one ear and out the other. One last interesting to note here is that the vocals done here seem to be full verses. I have no clue what Nia is saying, but hey, it sounds cool. There are written lyrics for one of the songs, but yeah, judge these on your own accord. And finally, that's all the albums. The whole pipeline from listening to mediocre EDM to solid atmospheric drum and bass to becoming a Hex rapper was kinda wild. For someone I consider to be one of the larger parts of why Atmos D&B is so big, her versatility really surprises me. Her sound now is, at the very least, distinct from the myriad of other drum and bass producers that followed in her footsteps. So hopefully now, people who just watch this video for some reason can actually see that she has more than one good song. If you manage to sit through all this, then maybe leave a like, a comment, I don't know. Either way, I'll be seeing all of you very soon.